Dear learners, welcome back to the third unit of this particular module, the first module of this MOOC. Unit 3 has been named as Development of Mass Media. In this particular unit, we will try to trace the origin and development of communication through the ages. We will try to discuss the early communication systems in India and how the communication system developed in India, and a little bit about the present status of mass media in India. So far, you have learned about the basic concepts of communication and then some basic theories to understand the system of communication. And now we will try to discuss the origin and development of communication through the various ages. So today we live in the information age. Communication and information technologies have pervaded every aspect of our existence in such a way that these communication technologies, they no longer surprise us, and we do not even give a thought about how they operate or how they have originated. And yet the information age has a history which is very fascinating. In this unit, we will try to delve into the history and discuss the evolution of communication. The history of communication can be traced back to the very beginning of life itself. Before the development of speech, the prehistoric man used to communicate by using signs and symbols. The origin of speech many years ago completely revolutionized communication, marking the beginning of a new age. Gradually, speech became more complex and different languages were born. It completely changed life and it became the carrier of history. The oldest known instances of use of symbols, as we all know, they are the cave paintings. As time passed, the cave paintings gave way to petroglyphs, pictograms, and then ideograms before writing could finally take shape about 7,000 years back. The earliest instances of writing could be found on rocks and stone pillars. This made it possible to store information in writing for posterity. It was a very good system that could communicate across time, but it proved inefficient for communicating across space because it was not possible to carry the information to long distances. Gradually, more portable media like clay tablets, stone tablets, they were developed. So much later, writing materials like papyrus, parchment, they came into use. So this gave a permanence to written language. The development of writing was rather slow. This happened because of the clergy who were at the helm of authority, having understood the significance of this powerful tool. However, the invention of paper in China in the 1st century AD, things began to change dramatically, and once the Arabians began manufacturing paper, the development of writing could not be confined anymore. So, what probably was the most important event in the history of communication that actually ushered in a new era was the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. He also discovered how to make good ink for this printing. Earlier, printing could only be done using wood blocks, but now information could be copied much faster with the printing press. So, this resulted in the rapid spread of information, which could not be restricted to the Roman Church anymore, and information became readily available to a wide section of the European audiences. The Bible was the first book which was printed using Gutenberg's press. Very soon, lots of other books were published, the news pamphlets, and then came the newspapers. The coming of newspapers in the 17th century marked the beginning of a new age. The concept of newspapers had its origin in Renaissance Europe, where handwritten newsletters were privately circulated among merchants. So these newsletters carried all kind of information, including news of wars, economic conditions, social issues, and even human interest features. But it was only in the 17th century that it took a concrete form. The predecessor of the printing newspaper was the news pamphlet or the Corantos, which were published only when some newsworthy event occurred. The first news pamphlet to start regular publication was the Weekly News of 1622. Within 2 decades, many other titles followed and gained momentum in the 1640s and 1650s. The first ever real newspaper in English was the London Gazette, which was published in the year 1666. For a long time, it remained the only officially sanctioned newspaper, in spite of the fact that many other periodicals also came into being by the end of the 17th century. The first newspaper to come up in America was the Public Occurrences, which appeared in 1690 but could not survive for long. The first successful newspaper was the Boston Newsletter, which began in 1704. By the beginning of the 19th century, print media had two more allies, the telegraph and the telephone, which helped the newspapers grow and thrive. In the 20th century, two more very important media emerged, radio and television, which in the true sense ushered in the era of mass communication. The era that we are living in today is the era of information technology. New technologies are emerging every day. The World Wide Web has made the world a very small place, and digital technology is the new mantra which is changing the very nature of communication. The early communication systems in India, if we talk about that, the communication systems found in ancient India are replete with romanticism. During the era when images and symbolic representations were the foremost means of communication, messages were written on leaves and stones. Music was the most remarkable and emotive way of communication. The rendering of the flute or the melody and the pitch of a song, these all carried meaning and effectively transmitted news across the villages. Information had to be transmitted across rivers and valleys. Drum beatings were used, bushfires, smokes, these were used to communicate. Later on, when oral communication developed, oral narratives, which were passed down from one generation to the other, became a very important means of communication. So these narratives were imbued with regional flavor and musical overtones, and they last till date. The birth of mass media in India took place at the hands of the British when James Augustus Hickey, he started the Bengal Gazette or the Calcutta General Advertiser in Bengal in the year 1780. So it was a two-sheet newspaper which carried basically gossip about the private lives of the East India Company officials. Since then, mass communication in India has come a very long way. Not only has print media spread its wing immensely, electronic media too has a relatively recent history, but it has a huge presence today. So, if we try to discuss the history of press in India, so unlike in the other parts of the world, it cannot be treated as one entity. The reason being, unlike in England or the other various countries where English colonies were established at that time, India happened to be a nation where the people spoke different languages. In that sense, apart from the English language press, which emerged in the early stages of British colonialism in India, there emerged the press in the different Indian languages. Thus, we will find the history of the press in India as one involving the advent and growth of the English language press as well as the language press, that is, the press in Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Tamil, Malayalam, Marathi, Gujarati, Assamese, and many other languages. However, we find a common thread uniting all these, and that was provided by the concrete condition of colonialism and the anti colonial sentiment determining the history of the press in India. It is important to suggest that the missionaries played a very important role in the emergence and the spread of the printing technology over the times. It is also necessary to note that the colonial anti-colonial binary that marked the character of the press in India was the development that evolved a little later than the arrival of the first newspaper in India. It is also important to note here that there were news reporters even before the British came to India. It is recorded that the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb, he engaged reporters in the various provinces, and their brief was to keep the emperor informed of the various happenings in these different provinces. This incidentally was the practice that prevailed as early as in the times of Julius Caesar. It is also recorded that there were instances when the reporters engaged by the emperor were paid off by the provincial governors to not report a certain developments that Aurangzeb, and because of that, Aurangzeb lost the Deccan region due to one such instance of corruption. So, the practice of engaging reporters to inform the emperor is certainly not an instance of journalism or modern journalism as we understand the term now. So, it existed long back. However, the arrival of the first modern newspaper in India, so as to say, happened in a similar context, and the idea of having a free press in India was to be found in the context not very different from that as it was found in the Roman era or in the Aurangzeb's time. Those who were at the helm in Britain and commanded the operations of the East India Company were guided by similar concerns, that is, that the officers of the company did not indulge in unpopular acts that will render the company rule unpopular among the people of India. They were keen that the long term interests of the empire were not jeopardized by unpopular and self serving acts of the company's officers. And it was in that context that the rulers relied upon the works of James Augustus Hickey, who was dismissed from his job in the East India Company in Calcutta after the publication of this particular first newspaper in India. So Hickey's Bengal Gazette, which was also known as Calcutta General Advertiser, it was first published on January 29, 1780. So it became, or it can be called, the first newspaper in India. Thus, the Indian press was the byproduct of the British rule in India. From such a beginning, the press in India is indeed now a major player determining all the walks of our life in India today. Apart from the newspapers and the magazines, um, the number of magazines is also huge. We now live in a society where the various other forms of media, such as the television, the radio, and the web, as well as news on mobile telephones, have arrived at the scene, and the expansion has indeed made life so different. So, if we look at the early efforts in publishing newspapers in India, the year 1780 is a very significant one, as it saw the advent of Indian Gazette by Messing and Reed. They were inspired by James Augustus Hickey, and this publication is brought out after obtaining the consent of the Governor General. The publishers of the India Gazette gave an undertaking to the company that they shall abide by any regulation that the company decided to impose from time to time. So it is a different matter that no such regulations were imposed, but the fact is that India Gazette belonged to a category of newspapers that worked as a collaborator rather than as an adversary to the East India Company in India. So this was followed by the Calcutta Gazette in 1784, and this was directly patronized by the East India Company. So the decade saw the arrival of such other papers such as the Bengal Journal in 1785, the Calcutta Chronicle 1786, and the Oriental Magazine of Calcutta Amusement in 1785. It is a monthly publication, and all these had stayed away from playing as an adversarial role in any sense of the term. It is also important to note that these publications folded up soon. It may be added that all these were printed in English, and the editorial contents were more in the nature of bulletins that were intended to be read by the officers of the East India Company in Calcutta. Richard Johnson, meanwhile, started the Madras Courier in Madras, and this publication started in 1785 and was recognized by the company, East India Company. The paper was sustained heavily from the funds from the company and the government's advertisements. It is interesting to note here that Boyd, who was the editor of the newspaper, he resigned in 1791 to start his own paper, Harkaru, in that year. So this paper, however, folded up with the death of its founder editor in 1792. So Madras Gazette was another paper which was founded in the southern city of Madras in the year 1795, and when the paper caught the company officers on the wrong side, its facility for free postage was withdrawn by the company-led government of Madras. So these all things are very important to understand the freedom of the press, or to understand the ownership of media, even if we are talking about the media freedom and media ownership in today's context. Again, the Bombay Herald was founded in 1789, and the Courier began publication in the western city of Bombay in 1790. So Bombay Gazette that began in 1791 and the Bombay Herald that existed since 1789 was subsequently merged with the Bombay Herald. This publication enjoyed recognition from the government and thus enjoyed the facility of free postage as well as preference for official advertisements too. In this sense, we find the principle of newspapers sustained by official advertisements. This is a revenue model that is central to the media industry even in our times. Okay, so it's emerging and establishing itself in those times itself is very interesting to note. So here the publication of Bombay and Madras were by and large pro-British, and thus they enjoyed the company's patronage. The following decade, however, witnessed the emergence of an adversarial press, and this development was most pronounced in Bengal. The Bengal Journal, which was under William Dewan, along with some others, it published a report that Lord Cornwallis was dead in the midst of the Maratha War. So this was in 1791. William Dewan lost his job as editor on that account. And the Bengal Journal, he started soon. It was also caught in enough troubles in these 3 years that it existed. Dewan was arrested, deported, and his wealth, which added up to a tiny sum even in those days, it was also confiscated. The decade saw many more of such incidents, but then there was nothing in the realm of laws to restrict the freedom of press in the specific terms. The point is that the last decade of the 18th century was when the press was as an adversary was emerging across the 3 provincial capitals, Calcutta, Bombay and Madras, and the atmosphere in England and the rest of Europe, where free speech was still prevalent, prevented any law as such being enacted. So it must be remembered that those were times in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution. Now let us talk about the early stages and the English East India Company and the press. So after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the terms that were made, the East India Company gained political control over the affairs of India. So there were a number of battles that the British fought against the various rulers across India. The 5 decades since Plassey were a time when the British consolidated their hold over the rest of India, and there were several instances during this phase when they were at war with the French, Dutch, Portuguese forces who had taken sides with plenty of petty rulers in different parts at the time. It must be remembered that all these European powers were engaged in capturing colonies in India at that time, and in that sense, none were fighting for the Indian people. So it is also a fact that while the British succeeded in colonizing most parts of India by way of war or through friendly treaties with the native rulers, the French succeeded in some way in the Northern Africa, and the Dutch and the Portuguese, they established colonialism in the Latin Americas. As for the concerns here, The company and the Governor General were determined to ensure that bad news about their activities, particularly reports about the war and the setbacks in that front, were not reported in the press. And this they ensured by wielding the threat of deportation of the editors who carried such reports in the press. And to that extent, the idea of free speech that ruled the scene in England was not particularly practiced in the by the English rulers in India. Thus, in May 1799, the Governor General issued the first press regulations. These regulations simply laid down that every newspaper carry in its pages such details as the name of the printer, the editor, and the owner of the paper. The regulations were made in necessary that the material meant to be published were sent across to the secretary to government before publication. In other words, the very first regulation of 1799 imposed a pre-publication censorship in India. And in the event of a newspaper publishing something without the approval, warranted deportation of the editor. So interestingly, those were still the times when newspapers were owned and edited by Englishmen, and Indians had not entered the scenario of press yet. The regulations of 1799 specified some areas that were not to be published, and the secretary to the government was the final authority to impose ban on such news. Those areas are movement of ships and embarkation of troops, speculations on relationship between the company and any other Indian rulers, information likely to be used by the enemy or the comments that were likely to cause excitement or alarm, statements of the public credit or the financial transactions of the company, or the comments on the life of the company's officers. So these areas were not to be touched upon by the press. Interestingly, all the newspapers that came out from Calcutta at that time agreed to comply by the regulations, but they did not submit their reports for pre-publication censorship on many instances. So these papers were Bengal Harkaru, Morning Post, Telegraph, Calcutta Courier, Oriental Star, India Gazette, and Asiatic Mirror. It is important to note here that the editors of all these newspapers were Englishmen. Lord Wellesley, the Governor General at that time, however, he could not achieve much against those who defied, and particularly because he did not find support to his anti-press attitude, from his masters in London. Moreover, the attempt to gag the press led to the emergence of an underground press with pamphlets appearing every now and then without leaving any trace as to where they were printed. So some of these were very interestingly, they were from the Baptist Missionary Press in Sirampur, which is now in West Bengal. Wellesley responded to the pamphleteering by issuing an order that all this printed matter must carry the name of the printing press where printed. Wellesley's concerns were not merely that of the war and such reports. So such pamphlets were also ones that attacked some of the cultural beliefs of the Indian people and were, they were thus evangelical. The company was worried about the consequences by way of hurting sentiments and the impact that it might have on the company's rule in India. So finally, after some serious attempts and after the arrival of Lord Warren Hastings, they issued some fresh regulations in 1818 by which the pre-publication censorship was abolished, and the rest of the regulations of 1799 they remained. So the British rulers also began to realize by this time that the threat of deportation was not going to be effective against editors. The reason was simple. We now find Indians arriving as editors, and they could not have been sent to England as was possible with the English editors. Now let us have a look at the role of media in the freedom struggle. So James Silk Buckingham, an Englishman, he was perhaps one who could be described as having sown the seeds of anti-British sentiment in a way. His writings were in Calcutta Journal, and they were primarily against the East India Company, where he advocated the direct takeover of the administration in India by the crown. So his systematic attack on the activities of the company can be held as the earliest of such writings which were published in newspaper that struck against the insensitive nature of the British rule in India. So Buckingham was deported to England in 1823 because of his activities, but he continued his journalism through the Oriental Herald, which was published from England, and his writings were in the nature of exposing the bad acts of the company officials and the Governor General, before the British Parliament. So in the 1850s, Buckingham rode the scene with well-argued articles seeking the abolition of the Court of Directors, who had exerted a lot of influence on the administration in India. So when India was brought under the crown by way of Queen Victoria's proclamation in 1858, so Buckingham also advocated the elected legislature in India and the idea of the Indian civil service, and he used his newspapers in his campaign. So this was also the time when Raja Ram Mohan Roy started Sambad Kaumudi. So there is a dispute as to the exact year, but it is either 1819 or 1820. So this newspaper was known for its campaign for social reforms rather than anti-British. In the same year, Bhavani Charan Banerjee, he founded the Samachar Chandrika, which in every sense represented the counter view of Sambad Kaumudi. The point to be noted here is that the idea of anti-British sentiment from where Indian nationalism took shape was emerging in its crucible. In other words, a critique of the British administration from a point of view of defending the tradition and beliefs that existed in India happened to be the early stirrings of Indian nationalism, because the seeds of anti-British sentiments were sown that way. Banerjee's Samachar Chandrika was perhaps the first of this genre of newspapers, and it survived until about 1855. It may be noted here that we now see the arrival of newspapers in Indian languages. Yet another newspaper of this kind was the Mumbai Na Samachar, started by Fardoosji Mazban in Bombay. This newspaper was in Gujarati and it survives to this day under the changed name Bombay Samachar. The earliest expression of anti-British sentiments in the direct manner was on the issue of indigo cultivation and the travails of the farmers in the Champaran district in Bihar. Neel Darpan. It was a play which portrayed the plight of the indigo farmers and that they were forced into cultivating the plant for use in the textile industry in Britain. It was printed in the form of a pamphlet in 1861. The Hindu Patriot, which was edited by Harishchandra Mukherjee, was a prominent newspaper in Bengal, and it was seen as a terror to the bureaucrats or the planters or the colonial rulers of that time. Another paper, Shom Prakash, in Bengal, played a major role in propagating the problems of the indigo farmers. The Bengali, which was founded in 1868, was another vocal campaigner of the indigo issue. So this paper was purchased subsequently by Surendranath Banerjee, and under him it emerged into a leading voice of early Indian nationalism. Then Sisir Kumar Ghosh from Amrit Bazar, this is a village in Jessore district, he started the Amrit Bazar Patrika, a Bengali daily newspaper in 1868. A remarkable feature of the Amrit Bazar Patrika is that though it was started as a Bengali language newspaper, Sisir Kumar Ghosh turned it into a English language paper in the wake of the Vernacular Press Act of 1878. So here we must know that 1878 Vernacular Press Act was intended to deal with the rising tide of the anti-British opinion in the Indian language newspapers. The law was criticized by a cross-section of the English language newspapers too, and this clearly was the reflection of the emerging patriotic sentiments in India. Surendranath Banerjee will be remembered for his forthright attack on the law. What he carried out was, sentenced to imprisonment for 2 months for his article that attacked the British judges. So the Vernacular Press Act of 1878 was soon repealed, and the Liberal Party, wrested power in England, and Gladstone, who had opposed its passage was the Prime Minister of England in 1880. So the rising tide of anti-British sentiment during that period would express itself in two distinct ways, one being the foundation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 and the other being the several acts of violence involving angry young patriots killing and attempting to kill Englishmen across the country. So Bengal happened to witness these in a big way. Now let us come to the English press, nationalist and pro-British. So it was not a mere coincidence that almost all those who had founded and edited some of the leading newspapers of the time were delegates to the first session of the Indian National Congress in December 1885 in Bombay. Dadabhai Nauroji was considered the father of the Indian nationalism, was acting as an editor of Rast Goftar. M.G. Ranade was there and he was the founder of Indu Prakash. Narendra Sen was editor of the Indian Mirror. G. Subramania Iyer was the editor of the Hindu. W.S. Apte was editor of Maharatha. G.G. Agarkar was editor of Kesari. B.M. Malabari was the editor of The Spectator. And the list is not complete, and among the delegates were many other editors of newspapers in English and Indian languages. So among the leading lights present at the first session, special mention is to be made of G. Subramania Iyer, whose newspaper, The Hindu, deserves a prime place in the newspaper history and freedom struggle of India. So it was founded in 1878 by a group of 6 young patriots. So the Hindu emerged as the nerve center of nationalist political activity. So much so that the third session of the Indian National Congress, which was held in Madras in 1887, it conducted virtually from the auspices of the newspaper. So the paper was mired in legal cases for its crusade against the British rulers in a couple of decades after it was founded, and the founders left it to be run by Kasturi Ranga Iyengar in 1905. So Iyengar himself did not dilute the nationalist commitment and steered the newspaper with further vigor in the years to come. Subramania Iyer, he left the Hindu to edit Swadesh Mitran. It is a Tamil daily known again for its nationalist commitment. The Madras Standard was another nationalist paper from Madras at that time, and it flourished as a nationalist newspaper under the editorship of G. Parameswaran Pillai. The Madras Standard, interestingly, was earlier a pro-British newspaper, and it was Pillai who steered it into as a nationalist weapon. So there were many that were pro-British newspapers, and they came to be known as Anglo-Indian. So this was more the reality in the case of English language newspapers that were published in that time. In 1861, the Bombay Times, the Courier, the Standard and the Telegraph, all of these were published since various length of time. They were amalgamated to make the Times of India. And the newspaper published from Bombay remained a pro-British paper until its English founders transferred its share to the Indians after independence. So the newspaper was sold out by its original English owners to the Dalmias, which is a leading industrial group at the time of independence. So the actual transfer took place in the 1950. The Times of India and its earlier versions were consistently pro-British. The Pioneer from Allahabad, the Civil and Military Gazette from Lahore, the Madras Mail from Madras, and the Statesman from Calcutta were the other pro-British newspapers that were established around the same time, and all of them changed track after independence in the same way as did the Times of India. So I hope so far you have got a very good idea about the emergence of newspapers or journalism, or we can say the start of mass communication in a country like India, which was under the British rule, and it started at that time, and how it has come to the scenario that we have today. So this will give you an idea, and this will help you in understanding the later units, the later contents that we will discuss during this particular MOOC course. Thank you, and we'll meet in the next video.